corrupt bank, a homeless veteran, and a millionaire with a conscience. When Hartford Federal tries to steal from the wrong man, they have no idea who's watching. Big Shaq isn't just a basketball legend. He's a man who knows right from wrong. And when he sees injustice unfold, he doesn't just walk away, he sets a trap. As fraud, racism, and corporate greed come crashing down, one thing becomes clear. When Big Shaq catches you red-handed, there's nowhere to hide. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun peeked through the towering skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the streets of Oak Ridge, a city of contradictions. On one side of town, luxury cars lined up outside high-end boutiques, their owners sipping artisanal lattes as they discussed stock markets and weekend getaways. Just a few blocks away, the scene shifted drastically. Cracked sidewalks, abandoned storefronts, and people huddled in alleyways, wrapped in thin blankets against the morning chill. Among them was Raymond Ray Carter, a man who had once worn a different uniform. A former Marine, he had served 2 tours overseas, only to return home and find himself forgotten. The country he fought for had no place for him anymore. His benefits were tied up in bureaucracy, and his job applications were met with silence. For months he had been living on the streets, surviving on handouts and the rare, good-hearted stranger. Ray held a small, wrinkled envelope in his hands, his last hope. It contained a check, a modest $2,500 inheritance from his late sister. It wasn't much, but to him, it was everything. Enough for a motel room, warm meals, maybe even a fresh start. He glanced up at the large stone building in front of him. Hartford Federal Bank stood tall, its glass windows gleaming, a fortress of wealth and exclusivity. Ray took a deep breath and stepped inside. Across town, inside a sleek penthouse apartment, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal stood by the window, looking down at the city he had grown to love, and sometimes despise. He had come from humble beginnings, raised by a strong mother who taught him the value of hard work, respect, and giving back. Despite his immense wealth, Shaq never forgot where he came from. He had made it his mission to help those in need, using his influence to lift people up. His phone buzzed. Jasmine, his assistant, sent him a message. "Shaq, you need to see this. A bank downtown, Hartford Federal, has been denying service to black customers. There are complaints, but no one's doing anything about it." Shaq frowned. He had heard of Hartford Federal before. Whispers of racial discrimination, shady financial dealings, and an unspoken policy of keeping certain people out. But no one had been able to prove it. He grabbed his keys. Something told him today was going to be different. Inside the bank, Ray stepped up to the counter, feeling out of place. The woman behind the glass barely looked at him as she asked for his ID. Ray handed it over, along with his check. A minute passed, then another. The teller, Jessica Holt, furrowed her brow and glanced toward her manager's office. She whispered something to another employee, a man in a crisp navy blue suit, Logan Whitmore, the bank's branch manager. Logan walked over, his expression unreadable. "We can't cash this check," Logan said flatly. Ray's heart sank. "What? Why not?" "There's an issue with verification," Logan said, though he never even glanced at the check. "Bank policy." Ray clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. "That's my money. My sister passed away and left it to me. I need this." Logan didn't flinch. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A few customers had started watching, their curiosity piqued, but no one stepped in. No one ever did. Ray exhaled, gripping the counter. "You're telling me you're not cashing my check because I'm homeless? Or is it because I'm black?" Logan's lips twitched into a tight smile, the kind that carried no warmth. "Sir, I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." Ray opened his mouth to argue, but suddenly 2 security guards flanked him. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything aggressive, yet here they were, ready to throw him out like garbage. The weight of humiliation settled in his chest as the guards took a step closer. Ray had been in worse situations, but something about this moment, being treated as if he was nothing, stung deeper than any battlefield wound. "Get your hands off me," Ray said, his voice firm but controlled. "Then leave," Logan said, "before we call the police." Ray looked around. The customers, the tellers, Everyone averted their eyes. No one would stand up for him. He had fought for his country, but his country wouldn't fight for him. Just as the guards were about to grab him, a deep voice cut through the air. "Let him go." The room fell silent. Shaq stood near the entrance, towering over everyone in the bank. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, most people hadn't recognized him at first. But now, eyes widened. Murmurs spread. Logan's confident smirk faltered. "I said," Shaq repeated, stepping forward, "let him go." Logan hesitated, but one look at Shaq's imposing figure made the decision for him. He signaled to the guards, who immediately backed off. Shaq turned to Ray. "You okay, man?" Ray nodded slowly, though the sting of humiliation still burned. Shaq turned his attention to Logan. "You run this place?" Logan straightened his tie. "I do, and we have the right to refuse service to anyone." Shaq's eyes darkened. "Yeah, I'm sure you do, but I got a feeling that policy only applies to certain people." Logan forced a laugh, trying to regain control. "Mr. O'Neill, this doesn't concern you." Shaq smiled, a dangerous, knowing smile. "Oh, see, that's where you're wrong. When I see people getting treated unfairly, it concerns me a whole lot." Logan cleared his throat. "If this gentleman would like to file a complaint?" Shaq cut him off. "No need. I already know what's going on here." He turned to Ray. "You got proof that check is yours?" Ray pulled out a worn envelope with the lawyer's name and address. Shaq took it and read the details carefully. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed. "Hey, this is Shaq. I need someone to verify a check real quick." Logan's face paled as he realized what was happening. Shaq wasn't just another customer. He was a man with connections, influence, and the power to expose the bank's corruption in an instant. A minute later, Shaq nodded and hung up. "It's real." He placed the check on the counter. "Now cash it." Logan hesitated, but the eyes of every customer, every teller, were now on him. He swallowed hard, then signaled for Jessica to process the check. Ray's hands trembled as she counted out the cash and slid it through the slot. He hadn't expected this. He had been ready to walk out empty-handed, ready to accept another loss. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone had stood up for him. Shaq clapped him on the back. "That's better." He turned back to Logan, lowering his voice so only the manager could hear. "I know what you've been doing," Shaq said, "and trust me, this ain't over." The tension in the air was thick as Shaq led Ray outside, leaving Logan standing there, rattled. Outside, Ray exhaled, staring at the money in his hands. "I don't know how to thank you, man." Shaq smiled. "Don't thank me yet. We still got work to do." As they walked down the street, Shaq's mind was already racing. He wasn't just going to stop with Ray. If Hartford Federal had been pulling this on one man, how many others had they cheated? This wasn't just an incident. This was the beginning of something bigger. The weight of the cash in his pocket should have felt like relief. Instead, Ray walked out of Hartford Federal Bank with unease settling in his chest. He clutched the money tightly, as if expecting it to vanish. He had won today, but something about it felt temporary, like a battle, not the war. Shaq walked beside him, hands in his pockets, his tall frame making him an undeniable presence. He didn't say much at first, letting Ray process what had just happened. People on the street recognized him, some pointing, a few pulling out their phones. But Shaq wasn't here for attention. "You good?" Shaq finally asked. Ray let out a dry chuckle. "I don't even know what that means anymore." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "They were ready to throw me out like garbage. I've seen it before. But what gets me is how easy they made it look, like they've done this 100 times before." Shaq nodded, his expression unreadable. "They have." Ray turned to him, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Shaq glanced back at the bank. Through the tinted windows, Logan Whitmore was pacing in his office, phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't just upset. He was furious. People like Logan didn't like to be challenged, and they definitely didn't like losing. "Something tells me that manager of yours isn't done with you," Shaq said, his voice low. Ray's stomach twisted. He had felt it too. Logan wasn't the type to let something slide. If he thought he could get away with stealing a homeless man's money once, what stopped him from trying again? They reached the corner of the street, and and Shaq slowed. "Where are you staying?" Ray let out a bitter laugh. "You're looking at it." He gestured toward a small alleyway where a couple of blankets and a worn-out duffel bag lay near a dumpster. "It ain't much, but the rent's cheap." Shaq studied the spot, his jaw tightening. He had seen a lot in his life. Poverty, struggle, injustice. But it never got easier. "I got a place," Shaq said finally. "A shelter, real clean, safe. I can set you up there." Ray hesitated. It wasn't pride. It was survival instinct. Life had taught him that nothing came for free. People offered help, but there was always a catch. Shaq seemed to sense the hesitation. "No strings. Just until you get back on your feet." Ray sighed, rubbing his temples. He wanted to say yes, but something nagged at him. That bank wasn't finished with him. "I appreciate it," Ray said, "but I gotta deal with something first." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Ray looked back at the bank. "I don't think they were just trying to deny me service. I think they were trying to steal from me." Shaq's expression darkened. "Yeah, and?" Ray's hands curled into fists. "And I want to know how deep this goes." Shaq studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's find out." Inside Hartford Federal Bank, Logan Whitmore slammed his office door shut, rattling the glass panel. His assistant, Travis Kent, a thin man with slicked-back blonde hair and a permanent smirk, leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "That was a disaster," Logan hissed. "What the hell happened?" Travis shrugged. "We've done it before. It's never been a problem. Who knew some washed-up vet would walk in here with Shaquille freaking O'Neal?" Logan ran a hand down his face, breathing hard. "We were this close to getting that money. Do you know how many of these cases we process without issue? The moment they walk out, their checks are voided, and we pocket the leftovers. Easy." Travis smirked. "Yeah, well, today wasn't easy." Logan glared at him. "That money should have been ours." Travis tapped his fingers on the desk. "What if it still can be?" Logan narrowed his eyes. "I'm listening." Travis leaned in. "He's homeless, right? What are the chances he still has that cash by the end of the night?" A slow, cold smile spread across Logan's face. Ray sat at a small diner, flipping through the few papers he had left from his sister's estate. Shaq sat across from him, watching as he studied the documents. The smell of coffee and fried eggs filled the air, but Ray barely noticed. "They knew," Ray muttered. "They knew about my sister's will, and they knew I wouldn't have the resources to fight back." He exhaled sharply. "They were counting on me giving up." Shaq nodded. "They do this all the time, to the people who don't have a voice." Ray looked up. "Then let's give them one." Shaq smirked. "I like the way you think." Suddenly, the bell above the diner door jingled. A man in a dark jacket stepped in, glancing around before his gaze landed on Ray. He made his way toward their table. Ray tensed. "You see that guy?" he muttered to Shaq. Shaq barely turned his head. "Yeah." The man stopped beside them and cleared his throat. "Raymond Carter?" Ray's grip tightened on his coffee cup. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Paul Weller. I work in private investigations. I've been hired to locate you regarding some financial discrepancies." Ray frowned. "What discrepancies?" Paul reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "According to our records, the check you cashed today was flagged for fraudulent activity." Ray's heart skipped a beat. "That's a lie." Paul shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But until it's sorted, we need you to return the funds." Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And if he doesn't?" Paul sighed. "Then we take it to the authorities." Shaq chuckled. "That's funny, 'cause I got a few authorities of my own I could call." Paul's expression faltered. He shifted slightly, suddenly aware of how large Shaq was. Shaq leaned forward. "Let me ask you something, Paul. Who hired you?" Paul hesitated. Then he scoffed. "I think you already know." Ray stared at the paper in front of him, then at the man who had delivered it. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't about fraud. This was Hartford Federal trying to intimidate him into giving the money back. Ray slid the paper back across the table. Tell Logan he's gonna have to try harder. Paul smirked. Your call. He turned and walked out, disappearing into the city. Ray exhaled, rubbing his forehead. They're not letting this go. Shaq grinned. Good. Neither are we. Ray chuckled despite himself. You always this stubborn? Shaq shrugged. You ever seen me back down from a fight? Ray sat back, his mind racing. He had spent so long just trying to survive that he never thought about fighting back. But now, he had Shaq on his side. Maybe for the first time in years, Ray Carter had a shot at winning, and Hartford Federal had no idea what was coming for them. The afternoon sun beat down on the city streets, its golden light bouncing off glass skyscrapers and casting long shadows over the sidewalks. The rhythm of Oak Ridge pulsed as people hurried in and out of buildings, taxis honked, and conversations blended into a chaotic symphony. Amidst it all, standing across from Hartford Federal Bank, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal leaned against a lamppost, a quiet observer in a loud world. Dressed in a simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers, he looked like just another man in the crowd. People passed by, some recognizing him but hesitating to approach. Shaq was used to it. His presence always carried weight, but today he wasn't here to be a celebrity. He was here because something felt off. His eyes locked onto the bank's entrance just as Ray Carter was being shoved out by 2 security guards. The scene played out like something Shaq had seen before. Another man, another place, the same injustice. Ray stumbled slightly but caught himself, his face tight with anger and humiliation. Shaq didn't move yet. He just watched. People noticed, but no one helped. A woman in a business suit gave Ray a passing glance before averting her eyes. A man sipping coffee near a food cart frowned but did nothing. Even the bank customers peered through the glass, but no one stepped outside. Shaq exhaled slowly. This was how the game worked. Ray turned away from the bank, shoulders slumped, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He started walking, his footsteps slow and heavy, as if every step was carrying more than just his body, but his past, his losses, his exhaustion. Shaq pushed off the lamppost and followed. Ray turned the corner into a quieter street, stopping near a bus stop with a flickering advertisement screen. He sat on the bench, rubbing his temples. He was so caught up in his thoughts that he didn't notice Shaq until the big man sat down beside him. Ray flinched slightly, then glanced at Shaq. Recognition flickered in his tired eyes. Shaq smiled just a little. Rough day? Ray let out a short, bitter laugh. Yeah, you could say that. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Shaq wasn't one for small talk. He knew when a man needed space. He let the silence settle before he said, Saw what happened back there. Ray's jaw clenched. Yeah? You and everyone else. Shaq nodded. Difference is, I actually give a damn. That made Ray pause. He studied Shaq for a long moment, measuring his words, his presence. He wasn't just another guy offering pity. He wasn't just here to say, sorry man, that sucks. There was something real in his tone. Something steady, something solid. Ray exhaled. They wouldn't cash my check. Why? Ray scoffed. Said they couldn't verify it. He rubbed his hands together, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. Didn't even try. Just took one look at me and decided I didn't belong. Shaq nodded slowly. They do that often? Ray gave a humorless smile. To guys like me? Yeah. All the time. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You want to get that money? Ray blinked. What? Shaq turned his head slightly. I mean, do you want to fight this, or are you just going to walk away? Ray let out a breath, shaking his head. Man, I've been fighting my whole life. I'm tired. Shaq gave him a long look. Then he stood up. Then let me fight it. Ray frowned. What? Shaq stretched his arms, loosening his shoulders. I want to see how deep this goes, but I can't do it as Big Shaq. He turned back to Ray. I'm going to walk into that bank like any other customer, see what happens when they don't know who I am. Ray hesitated, then nodded. All right. Shaq grinned. Stay close. This is going to be interesting. A few minutes later, Shaq pushed open the glass doors of Hartford Federal Bank, stepping inside as just another man. He had swapped his hoodie for a simple jacket and a baseball cap, keeping his head slightly lowered as he approached the front counter. The bank had the same sterile corporate feel as every other financial institution. Gleaming marble floors, cold lighting, employees in neatly pressed uniforms, flashing professional smiles at wealthier clients while barely acknowledging others. A teller, Jessica Holt, glanced up as Shaq approached. She was in her late 20s, with sharp blue eyes that flickered with immediate assessment. Shaq placed a folded check on the counter. "I want to make a deposit." Jessica took the check, barely looking at him. "Do you have an account with us?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, but I'm thinking about opening one." Jessica nodded, punching a few keys on her computer. "Let me see what I can do." Shaq watched her closely. Her tone was polite, but there was something else. Something mechanical, rehearsed, like she had done this 1,000 times. As she processed the transaction, Logan Whitmore stepped out of his office, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Shaq, lingering for a fraction longer than necessary before he turned to Travis Kent, who stood nearby. Shaq caught the look, the barely concealed suspicion. Travis muttered something to Logan. Logan's lips pressed into a thin line before he turned away, disappearing back into his office. Shaq smirked to himself. They were already watching him.
Jessica slid the deposit slip across the counter. "It should clear in about 2 business days. Anything else I can help you with?" Shaq took the slip, tucking it into his jacket. "Not yet." He turned, taking a slow glance around the bank. A man in a suit checked his watch impatiently. A woman counted cash in a discreet side room. A security guard stood near the entrance, scanning the room. And just for a second, Shaq caught Travis Kent peeking through Logan's office blinds. They were worried. They didn't know who he was, not yet. But they could feel something was off. Shaq strolled out of the bank, his steps unhurried, his mind racing. Ray was waiting outside, arms crossed. "Well?" Shaq nodded toward the building. "They clocked me the second I walked in." Ray frowned. "They know you?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, but they're paranoid, and paranoid people make mistakes." Ray exhaled, rubbing his chin. "So what now?" Shaq grinned. "Now we give 'em something to be paranoid about." Ray narrowed his eyes. "You got a plan?" Shaq nodded. "Oh yeah. And trust me, when we're done, they're gonna wish they never messed with you." Ray looked at him for a moment, then let out a slow chuckle. It wasn't the sound of relief, but something closer to hope. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't fighting alone. Shaq sat in the back booth of a small cafe a few blocks from Hartford Federal, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him untouched. His fingers drummed lightly against the table as he stared out the window, his mind running through the pieces of the puzzle. The bank was dirty. That much was obvious. But if they had done this to Ray, how many others had they cheated? Ray sat across from him, watching the steam rise from his own coffee, though he hadn't taken a sip either. He was still processing everything. The humiliation at the bank, the shady investigator, the way the manager, Logan Whitmore, looked at him like he was nothing. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about standing up for people who never got a chance to fight back. Shaq finally pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts before hitting a name. Detective Jordan Ellis. A man he trusted. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Ellis." Shaq leaned back. "You busy?" A pause. "Not if you're calling." Shaq glanced at Ray. "I need some insight on a bank, Hartford Federal. You ever hear anything about them?" There was a sigh on the other end. "You sure you want to get involved in this?" Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. "I'm already involved." Ellis exhaled. "All right, I can't tell you much over the phone, but let's just say there have been complaints, none that ever made it to court. Their paperwork is always clean, no hard evidence. But the stories? They all sound the same." Shaq nodded. "People walk in and their money disappears." "Exactly," Ellis confirmed. "Usually low-income customers, elderly folks, minorities. They delay processing, claim technical errors, hold on to checks, or flat-out refuse transactions. By the time the victims figure it out, it's too late. Most of them can't afford a legal battle, So they drop it. Shaq clenched his jaw. And nothing ever happens to these guys? Ellis sighed. Not unless someone catches them in the act. Shaq exchanged a glance with Ray, then stood. Appreciate it, man. You be careful, Shaq, Ellis warned. Guys like Logan Whitmore, they don't go down easy. Shaq smirked. Neither do I. He ended the call and turned to Ray. We need proof, real proof. Ray exhaled. And how do we get that? Shaq's grin was slow, deliberate. We listen. That evening, Shaq walked back into Hartford Federal, this time in a suit, looking every bit the high-profile millionaire they were used to serving. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The same employees who had watched him with suspicion earlier now straightened their backs, their smiles wider, more eager. Logan Whitmore noticed him immediately. He stepped out of his office, his usual arrogance replaced with careful professionalism. Mr. O'Neill, Logan greeted, his voice smoother than before. I didn't realize you were a client. Shaq returned a neutral smile, thinking about becoming one. Logan gestured toward his office. Why don't we discuss that in private? Shaq followed him inside, glancing subtly at the security cameras. They would come in handy later. Logan took a seat behind his desk, folding his hands together. What can we do for you? Shaq leaned back. I got a few accounts all over, but I like to keep my business local, thinking about moving a few million into a new bank. Logan's eyes flickered with excitement. He sat up straighter. Well, Hartford Federal would love to accommodate your needs. Shaq nodded, his tone casual. I assume you take security seriously. I've heard about fraud issues happening to some folks. Logan let out a fake laugh. Oh, you know how it is. Some people walk in without proper documentation,
Causing trouble. We have strict policies for a reason. Shaq's expression remained unreadable. Like the policy that got Ray Carter kicked out? Logan's smile faltered just slightly. Ah, that situation was unfortunate. But rules are rules. Shaq leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Logan nervous. You and I both know that was no mistake. You targeted him because you assumed no one would help him. Logan's jaw tensed. I assure you, Mr. O'Neill, we run a legitimate business. Shaq smirked. Guess we'll find out. He stood, shaking Logan's hand, but he wasn't leaving empty-handed. In the past 5 minutes, his phone, tucked neatly inside his jacket pocket, had recorded everything. Outside the bank, Ray leaned against a street lamp waiting. He had spent the past few hours watching the place, observing customers, noting who got quick service and who got turned away. The pattern was obvious. When Shaq stepped out, Ray pushed off the post. Well? Shaq pulled out his phone, pressing play. Logan's voice played back, clear as day. Some people walk in without proper documentation, causing trouble. We have strict policies for a reason. Ray's jaw tightened. That's not enough. Shaq nodded. Not yet. Later that night, in a dimly lit parking garage beneath the bank, Logan Whitmore and Travis Kent stood beside Logan's sleek black car, voices low. What they didn't realize was that Shaq and Ray were listening from a nearby car, recording everything. Today was a disaster. Logan muttered. First that damn vet. Then Shaquille O'Neal of all people walking in like he owns the place. Travis scoffed. He does own half the city. Logan clenched his jaw. We have to be careful. If O'Neal starts digging, he could ruin us. Travis smirked. Come on, we've been doing this for years. The system protects guys like us. Logan exhaled, shaking his head. Not if someone makes too much noise. Travis crossed his arms. So what do we do? Logan's expression darkened. We handle it the way we always do. We make it disappear. Travis raised an eyebrow. Carter? Logan nodded. If we can't take his money, we take away his credibility. We get him arrested, hit him with a fraud charge, make him look like the criminal. Travis smirked. And O'Neill? Logan exhaled. We stall him. Play nice, keep him entertained. Meanwhile, we wipe every trace of our old records. If he comes back looking for dirt, there won't be any left to find. Shaq's grip tightened on his phone. He had them. Ray, listening from the passenger seat, exhaled slowly. They were really gonna ruin me. Shaq turned to him. And how many others before you? Ray nodded, jaw set. Then we bring them down. Shaq smirked. Damn right. With the evidence in hand, they now had everything they needed to expose Hartford Federal Bank. And the next move? It was theirs. The morning air was crisp as Shaq stepped out of his black SUV, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit. The bank loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the city like a fortress of wealth and power. But Shaq knew better. Fortresses crumble when the foundation is rotten. As he approached the entrance, he could already feel eyes on him. The same employees who had barely glanced at him when he walked in dressed casually now straightened their backs, their smiles wider, their postures eager. The hypocrisy of it all made his stomach turn. The moment he stepped inside, Logan Whitmore was already making his way toward him. The man's fake smile stretched across his face like a well-practiced performance. "Mr. O'Neill," Logan greeted, extending a hand. "It's an honor to have you back." Shaq took the handshake, gripping just firm enough to make Logan shift uncomfortably. "Logan." His voice was smooth, unreadable. "I figured I'd drop by. Been thinking about moving some money around, maybe putting some into the right hands." Logan's eyes gleamed. "Of course, Hartford Federal would be more than happy to accommodate any investment you're considering." Shaq nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I like to give back. Been thinking about a big anonymous donation, something in the range of, say, 10 million. Logan's breath hitched, but he recovered quickly. "That's very generous." He gestured toward his office. "Why don't we discuss the details privately?" Shaq smiled. Hook, line, sinker. Across town, inside an unmarked black sedan, Detective Jordan Ellis adjusted the earpiece in his ear, listening to the live audio streaming from Shaq's hidden mic. His partner, Officer Raina Carter, sat in the passenger seat, scanning a tablet with the bank's records pulled up. Ellis glanced at the digital feed, showing live security camera footage from inside Hartford Federal. A sting operation had been in the works for weeks, but until now they never had enough to move in. Shaq had changed that. "You think Logan will slip up?" Raina asked. Ellis smirked. "Greedy men always do." Inside Logan's office, Shaq settled into a leather chair across from the bank manager, who was practically vibrating with excitement. Logan poured himself a glass of water, offering one to Shaq, who declined. "So," Logan started, "this anonymous donation, how exactly do you want to structure it?" Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I want it to be handled off record for now. No paper trail, no questions. Just want to make sure it goes to the right people." Logan hesitated. "I assume you mean a private trust?" Shaq nodded. "Something like that." Logan sat back, tapping his fingers against the desk, considering. "Well, I'll need to run this through our higher-ups, but if discretion is important, I can ensure—" Shaq cut him off, his voice dropping just slightly. "I know how things work, Logan. No need for the corporate script. I want guarantees." Logan studied him carefully, then nodded, lowering his voice. "If you're looking for something more exclusive, we do have certain arrangements for high-value clients." Shaq kept his expression neutral. "Go on." Logan leaned in. "We have ways to allocate funds outside of standard channels. For the right donor, we can adjust how certain transactions are recorded." Shaq let the words settle between them. There it was. The confession. He tilted his head. "You've done this before?" Logan gave a small chuckle. "Mr. O'Neill, we handle more money than most people can fathom. We know how to take care of our clients." Shaq smirked, pulling out his phone. He placed it on the desk, the screen still black, but recording everything. "So, let's say I know someone who had money stolen from them. How would that work?" Logan's smile faltered for just a second. "Stolen?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah, a veterinarian, homeless. Guy walks in here with a legit check, and suddenly, it's bank policy not to cash it. But you and I both know that's not really what happened." Logan's jaw tightened. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I'm not sure what you're implying." Shaq chuckled. "Come on, man. We're talking off the record, right?" He gestured around the office. "No cameras in here, just two businessmen talking business." Logan forced a smile, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. "Mr. O'Neill, I assure you, our bank follows strict protocols." Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "See, that's disappointing." He picked up his phone and tapped the screen. The audio playback began immediately. "We have ways to allocate funds outside of standard channels." Logan's face drained of color. Shaq stood up, towering over the desk. "You know, I wasn't sure how deep this ran, but you just made it real easy for me." The door burst open. Detective Ellis strode in, badge flashing, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Logan Whitmore," Ellis announced. "You're under investigation for fraud, financial misconduct, and discrimination under federal banking laws." Logan shot to his feet. "You can't do this." Ellis smirked. "Oh, we definitely can." He gestured to the officer beside him. "Start pulling records. I want every questionable transaction traced." Travis Kent appeared in the doorway, panic on his face. "Logan, what's happening?" Shaq turned to him, slipping his phone into his pocket. "What's happening is game over." Logan clenched his fists. "This is entrapment. You set me up." Shaq grinned. "Nah, man. You set yourself up the second you thought nobody would notice." Travis tried to back away, but an officer stopped him. Ellis motioned toward the bank floor. "Bring him out." A moment later, a group of former Hartford Federal customers entered. Men and women who had been scammed, denied service, or had money stolen. Ray was among them. When Logan saw him, his face twisted with rage. "You think some homeless bum is going to take me down?" Ray stepped forward. His voice was steady, stronger than before. "I don't think. I know." Ellis pulled out his cuffs. "Logan Whitmore, you're under arrest." As Logan was cuffed, Shaq leaned in slightly. "Guess you should have just cashed the check." Logan struggled as he was dragged past the growing crowd, his protests drowned out by murmurs and whispers. Travis followed soon after, his smirk finally wiped away. Shaq turned to Ray. "Told you we'd handle it." Ray exhaled, looking around at the people who had come forward. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Ellis clapped Shaq on the back. "You ever think about a career in law enforcement?" Shaq laughed. "Nah, man. I just like catching crooks." As he walked toward the exit, the entire bank felt different. Lighter, as if something rotten had finally been purged. Hartford Federal wasn't just exposed, it was done. The atmosphere inside Hartford Federal was tense, though most of the employees didn't realize it yet. The usual air of professionalism remained, tellers handling transactions, clients sipping complimentary coffee, and security guards standing at their posts. But behind the polished counters and the high-end marble flooring, something sinister was unfolding. Inside his glass-walled office, Logan Whitmore sat stiffly at his desk, staring at his computer screen. His assistant, Travis Kent, stood beside him, shifting nervously. The 2 men had operated in the shadows for years, but today, the walls were closing in. "This isn't a problem," Logan muttered under his breath, eyes scanning the forged documents on his screen. "It's a cleanup job." Travis swallowed hard. "You sure? Because if this goes sideways..." Logan shot him a glare. "It won't." He turned back to his monitor, where a digital version of Ray Carter's check was displayed. The original had been cashed days ago, thanks to Shaq's intervention. But Logan wasn't done. A duplicate check had been created, one that would be redirected into a private offshore account. If the system processed it before anyone noticed, Ray's money would be siphoned off, and Logan could claim it was a clerical error. They had done it before. They had never been caught. What Logan didn't know was that he wasn't alone. Across the street, inside an unmarked surveillance van, Detective Jordan Ellis adjusted his headset, eyes locked on the multiple monitors in front of him. Every inch of Hartford Federal was being recorded. Every keystroke, every whisper, every movement. Ellis turned to his partner, Officer Raina Carter, who was monitoring the live feed. "He's making his move," Ellis said, nodding toward the screen. Raina smirked. They always get sloppy when they panic. In another window, the bank's security camera feed was looping, replaying an earlier recording. The real-time feed, the one revealing the crime in progress, was being streamed directly to the police and several major news outlets. And inside the bank, Shaq was waiting. Dressed in a crisp blue suit, Shaq sat in the main banking hall, sipping on a tiny paper cup of bad coffee. He had positioned himself near a large flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, a screen that usually displayed market trends and investment updates, but not today. Shaq glanced at his watch. Right on time. Then, he pressed send. A second later, the bank's massive screen flickered, then changed. The room fell silent as a video feed appeared, a live-streamed view of Logan's office. The footage, captured from a hidden camera, showed Logan and Travis hunched over the computer, caught in the act of committing fraud. The customers turned toward the screen, confused at first. Then the sound kicked in. We process this now, reroute it through the secondary account, and by the time anyone asks questions, it's too late, Logan was saying. Carter is homeless. No one will believe him if he claims we stole from him. A murmur spread through the bank. Employees stiffened. Customers exchanged glances. Logan froze. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as the realization sank in. This wasn't just a leak. This was a live broadcast. His gaze snapped toward Shaq, who was still casually seated, arms crossed, watching the screen like everyone else. A slow smile spread across Shaq's face. Checkmate. Logan lurched up from his desk, slamming his laptop shut. Shut it off. Shut it off. Travis fumbled with the wires under the desk, but it was useless. The system had been overridden externally. They had no control anymore. The voice of a news anchor crackled through the speakers. We are currently streaming live from inside Hartford Federal Bank, where shocking evidence of financial fraud is unfolding in real time. Bank manager Logan Whitmore and his assistant Travis Kent have been caught attempting to reroute funds from a disabled veteran's account. Logan's face turned pale. His career, his reputation, everything was falling apart. He stormed out of his office, face red with fury. You think this is funny? Logan snarled, marching toward Shaq. You set me up. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Nah, Logan, you set yourself up. Logan whirled around toward the employees. Cut the damn feed. Jessica Holt, the teller who had been at the counter earlier, looked at him, arms crossed. I don't think so. Logan's breath hitched. His own employees were watching him burn. Then, the doors to the bank burst open. Detective Ellis strode in, flanked by uniformed officers. The moment Logan saw the badges, he bolted. Shaq sighed. Man, I hate when they run. Travis tried to take off in the opposite direction, but an officer tackled him before he got 2 steps. No, I didn't do anything. Ellis didn't even look at him. His focus was on Logan, who was making a mad dash toward the emergency exit. Shaq shook his head. All right, time to end this. In 3 long strides, he was at the door, blocking Logan's escape. Logan skidded to a stop, looking up, way up at Shaq's towering frame. Shaq smiled. Going somewhere? Logan's nostrils flared. You have no idea what you've done. Shaq's smile didn't fade. Oh, I got a pretty good idea. Ellis stepped up beside him, cuffs in hand. Logan Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, financial misconduct, and discrimination under federal banking laws. Logan's face twisted with rage. You can't prove anything. Shaq arched an eyebrow. Bruh, it's literally playing on live TV right now. Logan turned toward the screen just in time to see his own words being replayed for the world to hear. His shoulders sagged in defeat. Travis, already cuffed, was ranting like a man unraveling. This wasn't my idea. Logan told me to do it. I was just following orders. Shaq shook his head. Man, you folded faster than a cheap suit. As the officers led Logan and Travis toward the exit, the bank customers started clapping. The employees, some nervous, some relieved, watched as the men who had run the bank through greed and deception were dragged out in disgrace. Shaq turned toward the counter, where Ray stood, watching everything unfold. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. Ray met Shaq's gaze. He didn't have to say anything. Shaq nodded. The job was done. Outside the bank, as Logan and Travis were shoved into the back of squad cars, reporters swarmed the scene. The cameras flashed, the questions flew, and the story that Hartford Federal had been hiding for years was now out in the open. Ray stood beside Shaq, watching the chaos. What happens now? Shaq exhaled, hands in his pockets. Now? The whole system gets looked at. He glanced at Ray. And you? You get what's yours. Ray let out a small laugh, shaking his head. I still don't know how to thank you. Shaq smirked. Then don't. Just make sure the next guy who gets pushed down, you help him back up. Ray nodded. Yeah, I can do that. As the squad cars pulled away and the crowd of reporters swarmed to cover the biggest financial scandal in years, Shaq stepped back, blending into the city once more. He hadn't done it for headlines. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. The morning after Hartford Federal's scandal rocked the city, Ray Carter woke up in a real bed for the first time in years. He blinked against the soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling above him. For so long, his mornings had begun with stiff joints, cold concrete, and the weight of survival pressing against his chest. But today was different. He sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. The mattress beneath him was firm yet comfortable, the sheets crisp and clean. The room itself wasn't extravagant, just a simple, neatly furnished space in a quiet part of town. A framed picture of a basketball game hung on the wall, the only hint of who had made this possible. A deep voice called from outside the room. You gonna sleep all day, or you want some breakfast? Ray let out a small chuckle. Shaq. He climbed out of bed, stepping into the hallway. The scent of eggs and bacon filled the air as he made his way to the kitchen, where Shaq stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with effortless ease. Ray shook his head in disbelief. You really cook? Shaq smirked, sliding a pancake onto a plate. Man, I do everything. Ray sat at the counter, watching as Shaq placed a full plate of food in front of him. Not a handout, not a pity meal, just one man helping another. For a moment, Ray stared at the food. The simple act of kindness felt foreign after years of neglect, after years of being overlooked. Then with a deep breath, he picked up the fork and took a bite. It tasted like something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. After breakfast, Shaq leaned against the counter, arms crossed. All right, here's the deal. You're not going back to the streets. Ray exhaled, setting down his coffee. Man, I don't want to, but finding a job ain't exactly easy for guys like me. Shaq gave him a knowing look. That's where I come in. Ray raised an eyebrow. You got a job for me? Shaq pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Not me, but I know someone who does. That afternoon, Shaq and Ray walked into a local community center, a place buzzing with energy. Kids played basketball on the outdoor courts, while inside volunteers helped people with job applications and housing assistance. The walls were covered in photos of past events, food drives, youth mentorship programs, success stories. Near the back of the building, a man in his late 40s sat at a desk cluttered with paperwork. He looked up as they approached and immediately grinned. Shaq, man, I haven't seen you in months. Shaq bumped fists with him. Been busy. Got someone I want you to meet. He gestured to Ray. This is Ray Carter, Marine vet, hard worker, just needs a shot. The man, Daniel Greer, stood and shook Ray's hand. His grip was strong, confident. Nice to meet you, Ray. We always have room for someone willing to put in the work. Ray hesitated, glancing at Shaq. What's the job? Facility maintenance, Daniel explained. Keeping the place running, helping with events, making sure the kids have a safe space. Nothing fancy, but it's steady, and it matters. Ray nodded slowly, taking it in. A real job. A chance to build something again. He swallowed hard, then met Daniel's gaze. I'll take it. Shaq clapped him on the back. Good choice. Daniel smiled. Welcome aboard. Meanwhile, across the city, Hartford Federal was crumbling. The morning news was relentless. Every major network had picked up the scandal, replaying the footage of Logan Whitmore and Travis Kent's downfall. Headlines screamed about fraud, discrimination, and corruption, and the public wasn't having it. Protesters gathered outside the bank's main branch, holding signs that read, Justice for the Forgotten and No more stolen money. Customers flooded the phone lines, demanding answers. Stockholders panicked. Lawsuits were already in motion, and the bank's corporate office scrambled to contain the damage. Inside a sleek boardroom, Hartford Federal's executives sat in silence, watching the chaos unfold on a massive screen. One of them, an older man in a gray suit, finally spoke. "Shut it down." A younger executive blinked. "Sir?" "Close the branch," he repeated. "Disassociate from Whitmore, settle the lawsuits, and issue a public statement. This doesn't go away unless we make it go away." The younger man swallowed hard. "And what about O'Neill?" The older executive's jaw tightened. "We leave him alone." They all knew one thing for sure. Picking a fight with Shaquille O'Neal had been the worst mistake they ever made. Back at the community center, Ray wiped sweat from his forehead, stepping back to admire his work. He had just finished repairing one of the basketball hoops outside, tightening the bolts so the kids wouldn't have to play on broken equipment. Daniel walked up beside him, nodding in approval. "Looks good." Ray smiled, a rare moment of pride washing over him. "Feels good, too." Nearby, a group of kids were shooting hoops, laughing, carefree. It reminded him of a time before life got hard, before the war, before the struggle. Then, a familiar deep voice called out, "You ready to lose?" Ray turned to see Shaq standing at the edge of the court, spinning a basketball on his finger. Ray chuckled. "Man, I haven't played in years." Shaq tossed him the ball. "No excuses. Let's go." As the game started, a small crowd gathered. Kids, volunteers, even some of the center's staff. Laughter and cheers echoed across the court. And for the first time in a long time, Ray felt like he belonged. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ray and Shaq sat on a bench outside the center, watching the sky change colors. Ray sighed, shaking his head. Crazy how fast things change. Shaq smirked. "Nah, things don't change fast. They change when people make them change." Ray exhaled. "Guess I owe you everything." Shaq shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. Just promise me one thing, though." Ray raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Shaq turned to him. "When you see someone else struggling, you do for them what I did for you." Ray thought about it. The people who had ignored him, the system that had tried to bury him, the bank that had stolen from him. Then, he thought about today. The job, the community, the second chance. He nodded. "Yeah, I can do that." Shaq grinned. "Good." They sat in silence for a moment longer before Shaq stood, stretching. "All right, I gotta bounce, got a game to watch." Ray smirked. "Basketball?" Shaq chuckled. "Nah." Jeopardy! Ray shook his head, laughing. "You're something else, man." Shaq winked. "That's what they keep telling me." As he walked off, Ray leaned back, watching the stars begin to appear. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a new beginning. The old Hartford Federal Bank building stood eerily quiet, its glass doors locked, its grand logo stripped from the walls. Just weeks ago, it had been a symbol of power, a fortress where greed and discrimination thrived behind polished counters and empty smiles. Now, it was nothing more than an abandoned shell, a reminder of what happens when corruption gets exposed. Across the street, a new sign was being installed above the entrance of the very same building. Oak Ridge Community Bank. Unlike its predecessor, this institution had been built on something stronger than wealth: trust. Ray Carter stood among the small crowd gathered outside, hands in his pockets, watching the workers mount the sign. It still felt surreal. The place that had once tried to steal everything from him was now being transformed into something better, something honest. A voice beside him broke his thoughts. "Looks good, huh?" Ray turned to see Shaq, dressed in his usual casual style, simple black tee, jeans, and that ever-present air of confidence. Ray smirked. "Yeah, real good." Shaq nodded toward the bank. "You been inside yet?" Ray shook his head. "Not yet. Guess I'm still getting used to the idea." Shaq clapped him on the back. "Then let's fix that." Inside, the changes were already taking shape. The old sterile atmosphere of Hartford Federal had been stripped away, replaced with something welcoming. The walls now featured artwork from local artists, and instead of a cold corporate layout, the space had been redesigned to feel open, community-driven. At the center of it all stood Linda Graves, the new bank director. A woman with years of experience in ethical banking, she had been brought in to rebuild trust where Logan Whitmore had destroyed it. When she spotted Shaq and Ray walking in, she smiled warmly. "Ah, the men of the hour." Ray chuckled, shaking her hand. "Don't know about that, but it's nice to see this place changing." Linda nodded. "It's more than just a facelift. We're implementing new policies, fair lending programs, financial literacy workshops, and a commitment to serving the people this bank once ignored." Shaq crossed his arms. "And what about the people Hartford Federal cheated?" Linda's expression turned serious. "Restitution programs are in place. Every single person who was denied service, every veteran, every low-income customer, we're reaching out to make things right." Ray exhaled. "That's good to hear." Linda smiled. "And part of that? We need people who understand the struggle, people who can help us do better." She glanced at Ray. "How do you feel about joining our advisory board?" Ray blinked. "Me?" Shaq grinned. "You heard the lady." Ray hesitated. A few weeks ago, he had been invisible, another man ignored, another statistic. Now, people were asking for his input, valuing his experience. It was a shift he never thought possible. He met Linda's gaze and nodded. "I'd be honored." Across the city, things were changing. The fallout from the Hartford Federal scandal had been bigger than anyone expected. The media storm had forced state regulators to act, launching new investigations into banking discrimination. Laws that had long been buried in red tape were now being pushed to the forefront, ensuring that what happened to Ray wouldn't happen again. Protests had turned into discussions, and discussions into action. But real change wasn't just happening in government offices. It was happening in everyday lives. At a small diner downtown, a waitress named Tasha Monroe placed a cup of coffee in front of an elderly black man counting out crumpled bills. She glanced at the total and then at the man's tired face. A month ago, she might have ignored him, let him struggle. But now, she discreetly covered the remaining balance herself. "You're good, sir." The man looked up surprised. "Are you sure?" Tasha nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah, just paying it forward." At a barbershop on 5th Street, a group of men discussed the scandal over the buzz of clippers. "They thought they could get away with it," one man said, shaking his head. "If it wasn't for Shaq and that vet, no one would have ever known." Another barber, lining up a customer's fade, chimed in. "That's why we gotta look out for each other. Can't just wait for the rich folks to step in. We gotta be the change." His client nodded. "Yeah. Next time I see someone struggling, I ain't looking away." At a city council meeting, local leaders debated new financial protections. In the audience, a young law student named Alicia Torres listened intently, taking notes. When a councilman dismissed the need for stronger regulations, Alicia stood up. "With all due respect, sir, people's lives were ruined by this. It's not about politics, it's about justice." The room murmured in agreement. The councilman, caught off guard, cleared his throat. "We'll take it under review." Alicia sat back down, knowing she wouldn't let them forget. And at the Oak Ridge Community Center, Ray Carter had found his purpose. He had started volunteering in the evenings, helping homeless veterans navigate paperwork, find shelter, and reclaim their dignity. Because no one should go through what he did. One night he sat across from a young man, Caleb, barely in his 20s, who had been struggling to find work after leaving the army. "They just see a guy with no address," Caleb muttered. "They don't care about anything else." Ray nodded. "I know that feeling." He slid a paper across the table. "This program helps vets get housing, and if you need a job, we're hiring." Caleb's eyes widened. "You serious?" Ray smiled. "Dead serious." Caleb exhaled. "Man, I don't even know what to say." Ray patted his shoulder. "Then don't say anything yet. Just take the chance." That night, Shaq sat on the rooftop of his penthouse, watching the city below. He had seen it all: fame, fortune, success. But none of it compared to moments like this. Seeing lives change, seeing justice win. Jasmine, his assistant, stepped onto the rooftop, handing him a file. Thought you'd want to see this. Shaq flipped it open. Inside were statistics on banking reform, news articles about new policies being pushed through, and a final note. Hartford Federal officially dissolved. Shaq closed the file and set it aside, leaning back in his chair. Jasmine smirked. You don't seem surprised. Shaq chuckled. I'm not. He exhaled, looking back at the city. People think big change happens overnight. It doesn't. It starts with one act, one choice, one moment where someone decides to do the right thing. Jasmine nodded. And you did. Shaq shook his head. Nah, he smiled. Ray did. As the city lights shimmered below, Shaq knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The sun dipped low over Oak Ridge, casting a golden glow over the Oak Ridge Community Center, where laughter and conversation filled the air. The basketball courts were packed, kids running back and forth, sneakers squeaking against the pavement. Inside, volunteers were setting up for the evening's event, a celebration, not just for Ray Carter, but for the community that had come together to fight for what was right. Shaq leaned against the fence, watching the scene unfold. The fight with Hartford Federal was over, but this was the real victory. Seeing people stand a little taller, talk a little louder, believe in themselves a little more. Didn't think I'd ever see a day like this, Ray said beside him, his arms crossed as he took it all in. Shaq glanced at him. Which part? The part where you got a whole city backing you, or the part where you ain't sleeping on a park bench no more? Ray smirked. Both. Shaq chuckled, nudging him. Told you we'd handle it. Across the court, a group of teenagers played a pickup game, their movements sharp, full of energy. One kid, probably no older than 15, drove past his defender, faked a shot, then spun around for a clean layup. The small crowd around the court cheered. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That kid's got game. Ray nodded. Yeah, his name's Jalen. Used to be on the wrong path, skipping school, getting into trouble. Now, he's here every day. Says he wants to go pro. Shaq smirked. You tell him to work on that left hand? Ray laughed. Man, you think I'd let him play with a weak side? They stood there for a moment, just watching. Two men who had seen life at its worst, now witnessing something better. Inside the community center, tables were lined with food, donated by local businesses. People who had once been ignored, homeless veterans, single parents struggling to make ends meet, workers who had been cheated out of their wages, were now at the heart of something real. Linda Graves, the new director of Oak Ridge Community Bank, stood near the entrance, shaking hands and listening to stories. She wasn't just there for show. She was there to learn. A small crowd gathered around a projector screen where a local journalist, Darnell Porter, was giving a speech. His coverage of Hartford Federal's downfall had gone viral, forcing the government to finally take action. This wasn't just about one bank, Darnell said. It was about a system that has been rigged against certain people for far too long. But thanks to men like Ray Carter and Shaquille O'Neal, we saw what happens when you fight back. The crowd erupted into applause. Ray shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to this, being recognized, being heard. Shaq nudged him. Better get used to it. Ray chuckled, shaking his head. Man, I didn't do all this. Shaq's smile was easy. Nah, you just started it. Later that night, as the event wound down and people started heading home, Shaq and Ray sat on the hood of a car, watching the city breathe. The streets were still busy, but it wasn't the same. Something had changed. You ever think about what would have happened if you just walked away that day? Ray asked. Shaq thought about it. About the moment he had seen Ray being thrown out of the bank. About the choice he had made. To stop, to get involved, to give a damn. He let out a slow breath. Yeah, and I don't like it. Ray nodded. Me neither. Silence settled between them, comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, Ray turned to Shaq. So, what now? You just disappear back into the celebrity world? Shaq smirked. Something like that. Ray frowned. Come on, man. After all this, you're just gonna walk away? Shaq looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded toward the community center, where a group of volunteers were still cleaning up, laughing, connected. I don't need to stick around, Shaq said. The people got this. Ray exhaled, looking back at the center. He got it now. Shaq hadn't come in to be the hero, to take credit, to fix everything himself. He had just opened the door. The people? They had walked through it on their own. Ray smiled. You know, for a guy who dunks for a living, you're pretty damn smart. Shaq grinned. That's what my mama keeps telling me. A few minutes later, Shaq stood near the curb, hands in his pockets, watching as Ray said his final goodbyes to some of the volunteers. The man who had once been invisible was now a leader, someone people looked to for guidance. When Ray turned back, Shaq nodded. You good? Ray grinned. I'm good. Shaq smirked. You sure? 'Cause I can stick around, teach you a thing or two about basketball. Ray laughed. Man, I'd smoke you on the court. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh, it's like that? Ray nodded, crossing his arms. It's exactly like that. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. All right, all right. Next time I'm in town, we settle this. Ray extended his hand. Shaq took it, their handshake firm, filled with respect, understanding, and something deeper. As Shaq walked toward his SUV, Ray called after him, Hey, Shaq. Shaq turned. Ray smiled. Appreciate you, man. Shaq grinned. Ain't about me. It's about what you do next. With that, he climbed into his car, started the engine, and pulled onto the street. Ray stood there, watching as the taillights disappeared into the night. He wasn't sad. He wasn't lost. For the first time in years, he knew exactly where he was supposed to be. As Shaq drove through the city, he glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the skyline behind him. He had been in the spotlight his entire life, on the court, in business, in media. But tonight, he had played a different role. Not a hero, not a savior, just a man who had done the right thing. And sometimes, that was enough. Injustice thrives in silence, but change begins when we refuse to look away. This wasn't just Ray's fight. It wasn't just Shaq's victory. It's a reminder that corruption hides in plain sight, and it takes all of us to expose it. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Support local organizations fighting financial discrimination. Stand up when you see injustice. Share stories that matter. Because one voice can start a movement, and together, we can make sure no one gets left behind. Follow, share, and take action. The fight isn't over. It's just getting started.